world oil reserves were this vital channel which is funneled into all industries that are industrial countries that dominate the world. This is the actually oil reservoir of the whole world in this region. Both in terms of nations, it has age-old regions, nations with this long historical backgrounds. Therefore, for this region, they adopted a policy, and that policy was to the effect that in this region, countries and political units should exist in this region that have these characteristics. In the first place, they must be weak. Secondly, they need to be antagonistic and inimical toward one another. They should never get along. They should never stand united together. That's why you saw the policy of strengthening Arab nationalism or Turkish nationalism or Iranian nationalism, and of course, if continues year after year, this policy was pursued. In the third place, they need to be nations where political rulers need to be their own puppets. They need to be obedient. They actually must be those who bow to world powers' pressure. And this is what they actually did in practice. In the fourth place, in terms of economy, they need to be consumers, these nations. That means the oil that almost they get these oil resources from them at a very, very low price, almost at no price. The outcome out of that price need to be actually spent on imports and consumption so that Western and industrial countries would be further strengthened. These were among the policies. In the fifth place, scientifically, they need to be retarded, and they shouldn't be given the chance to advance and progress scientifically. These are each titles and topics, and each one of these we can actually write a book about, explaining, actually elaborating on each of these aspects I'm mentioning here, to the effect how in Iran and elsewhere in the world, they checked the progress and the deepening of know-how in science. Well, culturally speaking, they need to be copycats of the European culture. In terms of military, they need to be vulnerable and weak. They need to be kept weak. Morally speaking, they need to be corrupt and decadent. They should undergo various kinds of moral decadence, the people in this region. Also, on faith-based principles, it needs to be superficial at that level, and also only suffice to some ceremonial and individual, so as to speak, kind of practicing of religion. This was the picture they had created for themselves of this region. For this, they adopted their policies accordingly, and maybe thousands of hours they used the Western strategists they set together. They looked into it carefully, they planned for it, and their people here were appointed in countries in this region, and through those people they tried to push through all these policies. With this analysis, you can better understand the manners of Reza Shah and his son Mohammad Reza and also Mustafa Kemal in Turkey and other people. This was what they had on their mind, and they were successful. They were successful until before the victory of the Islamic Revolution. Apart from certain periods, short periods of time, and that in only parts of these they emerged victorious. Only in a few junctures, like in Egypt, for example, for a few years, there was a national government in power. In Iran, in other forms, and elsewhere in other forms. But generally speaking, when you look at it on an absolute basis, in all these areas, they progressed up until before the victory of the Islamic Revolution. But all of a sudden, this great, let's call it, explosion took place And this disrupted the whole thing. A man, a wise, prominent, prudent, jurisprudent, struggling, and brave, and a man who took risks. He emerged among the Iranian people, called Imam Khomeini. In fact, the presence of this man, the emergence of this man, and the training offered by this man was the job of God Almighty. This was a divine decision and faith for this to happen. And the people of Iran, too, were prepared. They welcomed this. They took risks. They entered the scene. They gave their lives, their properties. They went through an ordeal very successfully, and the Islamic Revolution took place. All these calculations and plans were disrupted. All those calculations got disrupted and rendered ineffective. The Islamic Revolution in Iran emerged strongly, and it continued strongly. In the first 2-3 years, it was not like this for a fervent zeal to emerge in the first 2-3 years and then fade away. That's not the case. It continued strongly, and later on I will talk about this continuation. I will mention a few points about it. Now the Imam stood fast like a mountain, and the people also very strongly stood behind him. The enemy, actually, the enemy front, because there was not one individual front, there was actually a front of enemies. They tried their best, they tried their utmost, whatever they could, they did whatever they could. From street clashes to ethnic clashes to military coups d'etats to imposition of the 8-year Iraq-imposed war on Iran, and also economic embargoes and sanctions, also launching this psychological war machine in the past 32 years. For 32 years, they have been launching this campaign against the Iranian nation, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. This psychological war has been going on for 32 years. All this happened. They lied, they made insults, they spread rumors, they try to create a wedge and divide us, to push us to go astray inside the country. The designs they were and the objectives they were pursuing in the first place, it was the collapse of the revolution and the Islamic establishment. Their main aim was to topple, was to ouster the Islamic Revolution. Their next aim was, if the toppling of the Islamic establishment does not take place, if it is not possible, then they would try to kind of transform and kind of change the revolution to something else. That means on the face of it, the revolution remains there, but the spirit of the revolution would fade away and would be destroyed. They tried their utmost again. The last scenario was this latest post-election incidents last year. It was an effort for a number of people inside the country, because of their selfishness and the love for themselves and for power, these moral ailments, if you will, they fell victim to this plot. The enemy was trying to, I have said this time and again, that they have been running, they have been actually managing this stage and planning all these things. It was always outside of our borders. It's always been like this, and it still is. Inside the country, some people cooperated with them, some of them knowingly, some of them unknowingly. And the third objective has been, and it still is, to do something. So if the Islamic establishment remains, then some weak elements that can be penetrated, those people could be used and try to actually kind of to address these people regarding the issues in the country. Then they wanted an establishment to be formed and to continue so that in a way it is weak and not as strong. Obedience is what they needed us to be, not to stand up against, not to rise against America. This is part of their objectives. All these and different phases and stages so far have failed to date. They have not been able to achieve those. Of course, they have tried their utmost. They have embarked on various activities. They have taken various moves. I will mention part of them during my sermons. They spared no effort, but they did not succeed. People were aware. We have elites among our people. We have great people. Our officials are working well. And, it was not possible for our enemy to fulfill its designs and objectives. The revolution has threaded its path and has progressed. Now, what happened in the revolution? This is important to take heed of. The revolution that took place in Iran, it caused some changes. When you look at it in terms of depth, these are significant and these are fundamental changes, if you will. Based on these changes, you can push the society forward and make great changes directed up ahead. These this basis was actually set on a strong basis. I will mention some of these changes. Of course, everyone is aware of these. We all know about these. It's before our eyes. We can see them. But as God Almighty has said in Holy Quran, God tells us, directs us at the sun. The sun is in front of our eyes, and God swears by the sun for us to pay attention that this phenomenon is so great for us to recognize. Therefore, it's necessary to mention these for us to pay attention, to be attentive. Before the revolution, the ruling body was actually the one which was deeply antagonistic toward Islam. They didn't look at the surface, but depth-wise, they were actually planning to eradicate the roots of faith in the hearts of the people. We have indications, memories, lots of them I have in my mind. We don't have time for that here. The revolution made let's say, a U-turn, actually. There was a sea change, and Islam was adopted as the major axis for running of the affairs and management of the country's affairs. The teachings and principles of Islam, they were adopted as the yardstick and as indices for accepting or rejecting the laws in the country. And as this U-turn was made based on Islamic teachings, before the Islamic Revolution, the country was dependent politically. That means the government, be it Muhammad Reza himself, the king, or various organizations, they were all waiting for an American order. We have lots of proof for this. A certain individual leaves Iran, goes to America, like Dr. Amini. He went to America to convince Americans so that he becomes prime minister. And he came back to Iran and he became prime minister. After a couple of years, then the king, the Shah, who opposed him, he went to the U.S. and he convinced Americans to actually fire him. And he came back to Iran and that person was fired as prime minister. To choose a prime minister, the king, the head of the state, needed the consent of the U.S. In many other issues, the Iranian king called the American and the British embassy, invited them to his own palace in order to kind of try to make